What life was really like for the first Americans. Hey guys, tonight we're going way back, like really back. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, let your phone rest gently on your nightstand, and let's slowly drift into a world before cities, before kings, before anyone argued on the internet. Tonight, we're talking about the first Americans. Not the founding fathers, not cowboys, not even the Maya or the Inca just yet. We're going back to the very first people who stepped onto the continents we now call North and South America. The original explorers, the ultimate road trippers, the folks who looked at a frozen wasteland and thought, sure, why not? And we're going to do this gently. No dramatic music, no intense survival sequences, just a slow walk through their lives. What they ate, where they slept, who they loved, what probably annoyed them. So, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Long before there was a United States, long before there was even a word like America, there was a stretch of land that connected Asia to North America, a wide, cold, windy place we now call Beringia. It existed during the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped dramatically. And that drop revealed a land bridge between what we now know as Siberia and Alaska. No passport control, no welcome sign, just wind. The people who crossed that land bridge didn't know they were crossing into a new world. They weren't trying to discover anything. They weren't planting flags. They were simply following food. Large Ice Age animals roamed those frozen grasslands, mammoths, giant bison, woolly rhinoceroses, and where the animals went, humans followed, slowly, over generations. These early Americans likely descended from groups living in northeastern Asia. Over time, small bands of families moved eastward, maybe chasing herds, maybe just spreading out because resources were tight. There was no grand plan, no leader giving a speech about destiny, just people walking. Imagine it. You wake up. It's cold, probably very cold. You wrap yourself in animal hides. Someone pokes the fire back to life. There's a discussion about where the herd was spotted yesterday. You gather your few belongings, tools made of stone, maybe a bone needle, some carefully prepared hides, and you move. Life was mobile. These early Americans were hunter-gatherers, which sounds simple, but it required an astonishing amount of knowledge. You had to know which plants were edible and which would quietly end your life. You had to know animal behavior, migration patterns, weather shifts, ice thickness, and you had to teach all of this to your children because there were no backup plans. Children in these groups grew up fast, not in a dramatic Dickensian way, but practically. A child learned by watching, by copying, by listening to stories around the fire, stories that probably included practical lessons hidden inside them. Don't go near that river in spring. Don't trust thin ice. Don't annoy the mammoth. And yes, mammoths were very much part of their world. For many early groups in North America, especially those associated with what archaeologists later called the Clovis culture, big game hunting was central. The Clovis people, named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, left behind distinctive stone spear points, beautifully fluted, carefully shaped, not something you make casually. When you find one of these points today, it's small, elegant, easy to hold. But 13,000 years ago, it was cutting-edge technology. Hunting a mammoth was not a solo activity. It required coordination, planning, probably a bit of shouting. Maybe someone tripped. Maybe someone always tripped. there's always one. The hunters would work together to isolate an animal, drive it toward a natural trap like a ravine or muddy ground. It was dangerous, but the reward was enormous. A single mammoth could feed a group for weeks. Its hide could become shelter. Its bones could be tools. Nothing wasted. But here's the thing. Not every day was a mammoth day. Most of life was quieter. Gathering plants was steady work. Roots, berries, nuts, seeds. In many groups, women likely did much of this gathering, though the old stereotype of men hunt, women gather is probably too neat. Survival didn't have rigid job descriptions. If you could help, you helped. And daily life wasn't constant chaos. There were long stretches of normalcy, repairing tools, preparing food, telling stories, watching children chase each other in the dust or snow. Because even in the Ice Age, kids were still kids. They probably played with miniature tools, pretended to hunt, maybe complained when asked to fetch water. Human nature doesn't change that much. Over thousands of years, these groups spread. Some stayed in the north, others moved south, and south, and south again. Within a surprisingly short time, archaeologically speaking, humans had reached what we now call South America. Sites like Monteverde in Chile suggest people were there at least 14,500 years ago, which means they traveled astonishing distances through unfamiliar terrain, across mountains, along coastlines. No passports, no maps, just movement. And as they moved, they adapted. Life in what is now Alaska was very different from life in what would become Florida. Different plants, different animals, different climates. The early Americans weren't a single uniform culture. They were many groups, developing their own traditions, tools, and ways of life. Some likely followed coastlines, living on fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. Coastal living had advantages, reliable food sources, fewer massive predators to outwit, and honestly, fewer blizzards. In warmer regions, people learned the rhythms of new ecosystems. They understood the seasonal cycles of plants, the behavior of smaller game. They developed new tools, new hunting strategies. Stone technology evolved. Different regions developed different point styles, which is how archaeologists today track migration and interaction. It's like ancient fashion trends. Oh, you're using that style of spear point? You must be from around here. But life was not static. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate shifted abruptly during a period known as the Younger Dryas. It became colder again, drier in many places. Ecosystems changed. Large Ice Age animals began to disappear. The mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the saber-toothed cats. Extinction is complicated. Climate change played a role. Human hunting may have contributed. It was likely a mix of factors, but from the perspective of a small hunting group relying on big game, the world was changing, and they had to change with it.
Without mammoths, diets diversified. Smaller animals, more plant processing, more local adaptation. This was not a dramatic collapse. It was gradual adjustment, a quiet pivot. Well, I guess we're not hunting mammoths anymore. Over time, many groups became less nomadic. Not immediately, but slowly, especially in areas with abundant resources. In parts of what is now the American Southwest, early experimentation with plants began. Squash, then maize, which originated in Mesoamerica and spread northward over centuries. Agriculture did not arrive overnight. It was adopted gradually, tested, modified. And with agriculture came something revolutionary: staying put. Permanent or semi-permanent villages began to appear.
storage pits for surplus food, more substantial shelters, ceremonial spaces, social hierarchies becoming slightly more defined. Because when you settle down, things get complicated. Land matters, storage matters, inheritance matters. Who controls the grain matters. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For thousands of years, most early Americans lived in small, flexible bands. Social structures were likely relatively egalitarian. Leadership may have been situational. Someone skilled in hunting leads the hunt. Someone wise in healing tends to the sick. Someone good at storytelling holds the group's attention at night. There were no crowns, no thrones, but there was culture. Spiritual life was rich, even if we can only glimpse it through archaeology. Burials suggest care for the dead. Grave goods imply belief in some kind of afterlife. Red ochre sprinkled over bodies hints at ritual. The land itself was likely alive with meaning. Rivers, mountains, animals, all woven into stories, origin myths, creation tales, explanations for why the world is the way it is. Imagine sitting by a fire, stars overhead, someone explaining how the coyote stole the sun, or how the first people emerged from the earth. These stories were not entertainment, they were identity. And identity mattered, because survival wasn't just about food, it was about belonging. As populations grew and spread, trade networks developed. Obsidian from one region appears hundreds of miles away. Shells from the coast found inland. People were connected, not globally, but regionally. There were marriages between groups, alliances, probably occasional conflicts. Humans, after all. But for long stretches of time, life was relatively low density. The continents were vast, people were few. You could walk for days and see no one outside your group. Silence was normal. Seasons dictated everything. Spring meant renewal, new plant growth, migrating animals. Summer brought abundance in many regions. Fall was preparation. Winter was endurance. Winter, especially in northern regions, required careful planning, food storage, warm clothing, shelters reinforced against wind. Homes varied by environment. In colder regions, structures might be semi-subterranean for insulation. In forested areas, wood and bark. In plains regions, portable structures covered in hides. Nothing standardized, everything practical. And within these homes, life unfolded in small, intimate spaces. Cooking fires, tool repair, quiet conversations, lullabies, arguments over who forgot to secure the food from curious animals. It's easy to imagine the past as grim and harsh, and yes, it could be. Injuries were dangerous, illness had limited treatment options, infant mortality was high by modern standards. But it was also deeply communal. You didn't survive alone. If someone broke a leg, the group had to decide to care for them, and evidence suggests they often did. Skeletal remains show individuals who lived years after serious injuries, which means someone fed them, protected them, carried them when necessary. Compassion is ancient. Over millennia, the descendants of these first Americans developed astonishing diversity, from Arctic hunter-fishers to desert farmers, from mound builders in the eastern woodlands to complex societies in Mesoamerica and the Andes. But at the beginning, it was small groups crossing a windy land bridge. No one knew they were the first Americans. They were just people, cold, hungry sometimes, tired often, in love occasionally, grieving when necessary, laughing when they could.
And that's where we'll gently pause for now. In the next stretch, we'll drift deeper into how their societies slowly transformed, how farming reshaped daily routines, how villages turned into towns, and entirely new worlds emerged long before Europeans ever arrived. So keep the lights low. Let your thoughts wander across ancient grasslands, and we'll continue our slow journey into the deep past.
All right, settle back in. Maybe you've shifted to the cooler side of the pillow. Maybe the room is quiet except for the soft hum of a fan. Good, because now we're going to float forward in time, very slowly, and watch something subtle but world-changing happen. The first Americans, those long-distance walkers from the Ice Age, had spent thousands of years moving with the seasons, following herds, gathering what grew naturally, living light, carrying only what they needed. But eventually, in certain places, some of them looked around and thought, you know what, this spot is actually pretty nice. And instead of packing up when winter faded, they stayed. Now, they didn't all do this at once. There was no continental meeting where everyone voted on agriculture. Different groups experimented at different times, and some never fully settled at all. Mobility, after all, had worked beautifully for millennia. But in regions like Mesoamerica, people began to experiment with plants in a very intentional way. One of the most important of these plants was maize, corn, the golden superstar of early American agriculture. It didn't begin as the plump ears we picture today. It evolved slowly from a wild grass called teosinte, and early farmers had to patiently select seeds from plants that showed slightly better traits. It was not glamorous work. Imagine crouching in a field under a hot sun, carefully tending small plots. No tractors, no irrigation systems with timers, just hands, simple tools, and patience. But maize had advantages. It could be stored, dried, ground into meal, turned into something reliable, and reliability changes everything. Because when food becomes more predictable, life becomes less about constant movement and more about building. Villages began to form in places where farming thrived, small at first, just a handful of families, homes made of mud, wood, thatch, circular or rectangular depending on local traditions. And daily life shifted. Instead of waking up and scanning the horizon for migrating animals, people woke up and checked their crops. They worried about rainfall, about pests, about whether the storage pit was sealed properly. Farming created new kinds of anxiety. Congratulations! But it also created community structures that were more permanent. When you stay in one place, you start to notice things differently. You learn the rhythm of the river's flooding, the exact week certain birds return, the way the light hits the hills in autumn. You bury your dead nearby, not miles away on some seasonal route. You mark their graves, you remember. And with permanence comes tradition. Ceremonial spaces began to appear in some early settlements, shared gathering areas, places for rituals tied to planting and harvest. Because when your survival depends on crops, you tend to develop strong feelings about the sky. Rain becomes sacred, the sun becomes sacred, time itself becomes sacred. In parts of what is now the American Southwest, early Puebloan ancestors, often referred to as the Ancestral Puebloans, began forming communities that relied on maize agriculture. They built pit houses, partially underground, for insulation. Later, they constructed above-ground dwellings from stone and adobe. Life here required careful water management. The desert is not forgiving. Farming meant observing subtle climate shifts year after year, and families worked together constantly. Children learned to grind maize on stone metates. The steady, rhythmic scraping sound probably filled the air daily. It's almost meditative when you think about it. Grind, lift, grind again. Meals were simpler than modern cuisine, but deeply nourishing. Cornmeal porridge, squash stews, beans, occasionally small game or turkey. And unlike the massive mammoth hunts of the Ice Age, food production became steady and repetitive. Repetition, oddly enough, can be comforting.
In the eastern woodlands of North America, different groups developed what's often called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. They cultivated native plants like goosefoot, sumpweed, and sunflower long before maize fully dominated the region. Villages here might be nestled near rivers, wooden houses, palisade walls in some cases, because once you store food, other groups might notice. Yes, staying put made you slightly more visible. And visibility sometimes meant conflict. Nothing dramatic, no epic movie battles, but occasional raids likely happened, disputes over territory or resources. Humans have always been human. Yet trade flourished too. Obsidian traveled hundreds of miles. Seashells from the Gulf Coast found their way inland. Copper from the Great Lakes region was shaped into ornaments and tools. People were connected by exchange networks long before highways existed. Imagine walking for weeks to trade a bundle of hides for beautifully crafted shell beads. News traveled along these routes too. Stories, marriages arranged between distant groups, new farming techniques shared. Over generations, some communities grew impressively complex. In what is now Louisiana, at a site called Poverty Point, people built enormous earthen ridges and mounds around 1700 BCE. This was centuries before the Egyptian pyramids were completed, by the way, just casually building large-scale earthworks in North America. And they did it without draft animals, without metal tools, just baskets of soil carried by hand. Why? Probably ceremonial reasons, social cohesion, identity. It wasn't about luxury, it was about belonging to something bigger. As populations increased, social roles became more specialized, not dramatically rigid, but noticeable. Some individuals likely became skilled ritual leaders. Others focused more on tool-making. Some excelled at long-distance trade. Leadership may have become more formal in certain regions. But for most people, life remained grounded in daily routine. Wake up, tend fields, repair a roof, prepare food, care for children, repeat. There is something almost beautifully ordinary about it. And through all of this, nature remained powerful. Droughts could devastate crops. Harsh winters could strain food supplies. Floods could wash away carefully tended fields. The land provided, but it also demanded respect. Communities adapted constantly. Some migrated when conditions worsened. Others innovated irrigation techniques. Some diversified crops to reduce risk. Flexibility was still survival. In Mesoamerica, farming eventually supported the growth of more densely populated centers. Over many centuries, villages expanded into towns, towns into early cities. But even before monumental pyramids and royal dynasties, there were generations of quiet farmers laying the groundwork. Literally. The first Americans were no longer just wanderers across icy plains. They were builders, planters, engineers of soil and water. Yet in settled life, old traditions lingered. Hunting did not disappear. Wild plants were still gathered.
Seasonal mobility continued in some regions. Farming was layered onto older knowledge, not replacing it entirely. Grandparents may have told stories of ancestors who followed mammoths across frozen lands. Children may have listened with wide eyes, glancing at their tidy maize fields and thinking, "That sounds exhausting." And maybe it was. But each stage of life had its own challenges. The nomadic bands of the Ice Age faced scarcity and constant movement. The early farmers faced labor-intensive routines and environmental risks. Neither was easy, neither was primitive in the dismissive sense people sometimes use. Both required intelligence, cooperation, and resilience. As centuries passed, the Americas became home to an astonishing diversity of cultures, languages, and lifeways. From Arctic seal hunters to tropical horticulturalists, from mound builders to desert dwellers. And it all began with those first quiet footsteps across Beringia. No headlines, no fanfare, just humans doing what humans do best, adapting. So as you rest there, maybe picture a small village at dusk, smoke rising from cooking fires, the soft murmur of conversation, the steady grinding of maize, children slowing down as sleep pulls at them. The stars above look exactly like the ones you see tonight. Different world, same sky. And in our next gentle drift, we'll explore how some of these early communities blossomed into powerful civilizations long before European ships appeared on any horizon. For now, just breathe and let the ancient fields fade softly into the dark. All right, welcome back. The room is quiet. The world outside is probably busy, but we are not. We are drifting again, slowly, across centuries. In the last part, we left off with small farming villages, modest homes, storage pits full of maize, the steady rhythm of daily work. Nothing flashy, just people figuring out how to stay in one place without starving. Now let's gently move forward and watch something almost magical happen. Some of those villages grew. Not overnight, not with fireworks, just gradually. A few more houses, a few more families, a few more fields stretching toward the horizon. And then, eventually, something bigger. In Mesoamerica, particularly in what is now southern Mexico, early societies began organizing themselves in increasingly complex ways. Long before the Aztecs or Maya built towering pyramids, there were the Olmec, often called one of the earliest major civilizations in the region. Now imagine living in a humid, tropical environment. Thick forests, rivers winding through lowlands, the air heavy with moisture. Farming here required clearing land carefully, managing water, and understanding the seasons intimately. The Olmec did more than farm. They built ceremonial centers. Massive stone heads, some weighing up to 20 tons, were carved and transported without wheels or draft animals. Just human effort, ropes, logs, coordination, probably a lot of sighing and back pain. Why carve enormous stone heads? Likely to honor rulers or important figures, which tells us something very important. Leadership had changed. In earlier small villages, authority may have been flexible and community-based, but now, in larger populations, hierarchy became more visible. Certain individuals gained prestige, perhaps through lineage, ritual power, or control over resources, and with prestige came monuments. Life for ordinary people, however, was still grounded in daily labor, farming maize, beans, and squash, fishing in rivers, weaving textiles, crafting pottery. Children still ran between houses, elders still told stories, but the backdrop had shifted. Ceremonial plazas, raised platforms, organized urban layouts. These were no longer scattered huts, these were planned spaces. Let's drift northward for a moment. In what is now the Mississippi River Valley, communities eventually developed into what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture. Around 1000 CE, large urban centers like Cahokia emerged near present-day Illinois. Cahokia was enormous by the standards of its time. At its peak, it may have housed tens of thousands of people. Wooden houses clustered around massive earthen mounds. Monk's Mound, the largest, still stands today, quiet and grassy, but once supported a large structure at its summit, likely the residence of a powerful leader. Imagine living there. You wake up in a bustling settlement, smoke rising from hundreds of cooking fires, traders arriving with goods from distant regions, ceremonies taking place on scheduled days. There would have been noise, activity, organization, yet daily life remained surprisingly familiar. People farmed maize intensively. They stored surplus grain. They crafted tools from stone and bone. They decorated pottery with intricate designs. They wore clothing made from woven fibers and animal hides. And just like in smaller villages, community still mattered. Religious beliefs grew more elaborate as societies became more complex. In Mississippian culture, we see evidence of a shared symbolic system, sometimes called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Symbols carved in shell and copper, bird imagery, mythical beings. These were not random decorations. They reflected a world view, a sense of order in the universe. Meanwhile, in the American Southwest, the Ancestral Puebloans were building remarkable stone and adobe dwellings in places like Chaco Canyon. Chaco was not just a random collection of buildings. It was architecturally aligned with celestial events. Some structures appear carefully oriented to mark solstices and lunar cycles. Time, again, mattered deeply. Living in Chaco Canyon would have required coordination. Roads connected distant communities. Great houses with hundreds of rooms were constructed over decades. But for the average resident, daily life meant grinding corn, hauling water, repairing masonry walls, participating in rituals within kivas, circular ceremonial rooms partially underground. The climate here was fragile. Periodic droughts strained resources, and eventually, prolonged drought contributed to Chaco's decline. Which reminds us that no civilization, no matter how organized, is immune to environmental pressure. Let's gently slide south again, into the Maya world. Language flourished across parts of present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Unlike the image of a single empire, the Maya world consisted of city-states, each with its own ruler, alliances, and rivalries. Cities like Tikal and Palenque rose above the jungle canopy with stepped pyramids and carved stelae recording royal histories. Now, here's where life splits slightly. For elites, the kings and nobles, life could be ritual-heavy. Elaborate ceremonies, complex calendars, writing systems carved into stone, astronomy studied with astonishing precision. But for most Maya people, life was agricultural. Milpa farming involved clearing small plots in the forest, planting maize, beans, and squash, and rotating fields to allow soil recovery. Homes were typically simple, wooden frames with thatched roofs. Families worked together daily. Markets buzzed with exchange. Cacao beans were valued. Salt traveled inland. Obsidian blades were prized. And beneath the grandeur of pyramids and inscriptions, there was routine: cooking, weaving, tool-making, child-rearing. Even in highly developed societies, most people lived lives centered on family and food. Now, let's pause for a moment. Across the Americas, from Arctic tundra to tropical jungle, societies had developed astonishing diversity. Some remained nomadic. Inuit ancestors in the Arctic mastered marine hunting, building snow houses, igloos, and using kayaks with breathtaking efficiency. Others constructed cities rivaling those of Europe in size and organization long before European contact. And none of these societies were waiting to be discovered. They were fully alive, fully developed, dynamic. They had trade routes, diplomatic relationships, spiritual systems, art, architecture, and science. They had arguments, festivals, political struggles, love stories, generational tensions, the whole human package. Life expectancy was shaped by environment and health challenges. Infant mortality remained a reality. Diseases existed, though different from those later introduced by Europeans. Yet communities endured for centuries. Adaptation remained the central thread. When drought struck, people relocated. When soils depleted, they adjusted farming strategies. When leaders failed, power shifted. The story of the first Americans is not a straight line. It's a web of local stories unfolding simultaneously across two vast continents. And all of it traces back, quietly, to those first footsteps across Beringia. From small bands crossing icy plains to cities aligned with the stars. From mammoth hunts to monumental earthworks. From portable shelters to planned urban centers. And still, at the heart of it all, ordinary people waking up at dawn, preparing food, caring for family, telling stories under the same night sky. So, as you relax there, imagine the Americas just before European ships appear on the horizon. Dense forests, wide rivers, thriving cities, countless languages spoken, smoke rising from thousands of hearths. A world complete in itself. In our next drift, we'll gently approach the moment when two hemispheres finally collide, and how that meeting changed everything. But for now, just let the ancient cities fade softly into darkness and rest.